So, yeah, I'm Mike White. I think I've seen most of you. I see that we got somebody from Iowa State here too. How's everything going?
Great.
You like it down here?
Yeah.
The weather's better.
It is.
Yeah. The weather's not bad. So what I'm gonna start out with, you've got these you're gonna be the graders. This is the document I got done last night. And I actually had it printed off last night. And then this morning I got up and had a cup of coffee and I read it again and I said, oh shit. Don't ever try to finish your last document on a bottle of wine. It don't work. So right? Right. So I corrected, I think it's corrected. If you see anything wrong with it or if you want to add to it, let me know because that's kind of the first edition out, and I'll be more than willing to change some things. Here's something that certainly isn't, I think some of you may have seen this before. I keep on upgrading it as far as variety. This is my pruning cheat sheet, everything you need to know when you walk into a vineyard as far as pruning. And a lot of it kind of corresponds with some of the information there. And now this is, I don't have vinifera in here. There's some the varieties or cultivars you're going down here. I don't have on there, but I got quite a few. But it's a good instructional piece. How many have you seen this before? You have. Okay. Who hasn't seen it? So essentially what it does is you can do the same thing. This is a spreadsheet that I can send you also. So you can put your own varieties in there and what information. But it gives you an idea when you look for balancing your vineyard as far as crop yield and that. You can look at average cluster sizes and look at some average yields that could be expected of that. Is cluster thinning needed? Is there a lot of basal shoots coming out at the base of that cane that you're going to get? Also, probably the most important thing is what we're going to talk about here is the cold hardiness, and you can look at kind of where you're at on that. A little bit about pruning terms, and then that optimum vine characteristics. And once you're in your, if you're like Terry, how long have you been growing grapes?
Since 2000.
2000, so you've got 14 years.
Yeah.
Usually about takes 7 or 8 years before you become one with your vineyard and you hit nirvana, right? And you're there.
Oh, I'm there, I'm ready to tear it out and go do something different.
But after about, what I see in a lot of vineyards, is after about 7 or 8 years, people kind of understand all this stuff and it soaks in, so they can look at their vine when they're pruning, and if they know what they're doing, And I'll be honest with you, is that being a corn and soybean agronomist, forage agronomist in Central Iowa, when I first got into this, it took me 4 hours before I understood the concept of pruning. And quite frankly, I will learn a little bit more every year, but it took me about 4 years. 4 years to learn how to prune and all that. So when I do field days and stuff, I just grab that really quick and reminds me kind of what that cultivar is. And if you don't know how to deal with that cultivar, I don't know how the hell you're going to prune it, because they're all different. Okay, they're all different. So that's something you can look at. And then, do you have extra one of those sheets for me?
You don't have to memorize? Come on.
Oh, yeah. Down here at under resources, that number 1 resource, and I've got it out in my pickup, and Diane, maybe you could run out there and do it. My knapsack right behind my seat. There's a book in there that's called Winter Injury Grapevines. It's right behind my computer. If you could bring that, I sure would appreciate that. Probably the number 1 Bible for winter injury and grapevines and how to manage afterwards, and it also includes winter as far as frost injury to buds. I'm not going to address that, though. If you want to talk about it, that's sums up it all. It's winter entry, grapevines and methods of protection. It's free online. It's like 108-page or 20-page book. Or you can order a hard copy for a fee, but it's free online there. That's probably the #1 guide most people go to for winter injuries, 2007 edition. Tom is kind of one of the top vineyard people in the nation, especially with cold climate grapes, and he's at Michigan State University. He's got a lot of experience. He was at Cornell for a while, but it's an excellent book to start out with. And then another one is this, primarily Dr. Kevin Kerr there, and his sidekick Ryan Brewster. He's at Brock University. He's got his PhD out of there, and he runs a consulting company up there in Canada. And he works with the university, does a lot of research, and does private consulting and private research. Thank you. Anybody here have this book? Well, it's free online. I'm going to pass that around. That's kind of the Bible for cold injury to vineyard. So a lot of it comes from there and some other resources here. And then, of course, I've got the new plant hardiness zone map at the end, kind of tell you where you're at. And you can see Kansas is, well, you're a little bit different than Iowa, for a little bit. You're getting in the south of the Mason-Dixon line where you can start growing vinifera where we can up here. So you can refer to that. I want to ask you folks, how many people had winter injury this year down here? You had 240 injuries.
Every year.
Every year. Did anybody else have any winter? Just you? What did you have?
Well, our vineyard is mostly Shamerson and Traminette. Well, we got a freeze, a real late freeze. May 16, 17, something like that, right when everything was flowering. So our Traminette basically had no fruit. Shamerson had about a third of the crop.
Do you remember Doug Baker when he was down here 2 years ago talking about Vignola at the annual conference? He's got
Sounds familiar, yeah.
Madison County Winery. I was with Doug, I'm going to say it was probably late June, just before July 4th, and I stopped by this winery in Madison County, down south, over by Winterset. And I said, let's look at your Vignola. He hadn't been out there. He had some hired help. Beautiful. I mean, it's canopy management, it all tucked into the SP. Only one problem. I said, Doug, there's no fruit out here. There wasn't one single cluster on his Vignola. Wow. And it was because of the winter. To give you some ideas, that North Dakota pretty well got wiped out. They probably had 60–80% of their crop knocked out. South Dakota, Minnesota, probably, I'm going to say it was anywhere from reports of 50 to 60% plus. Some of them had as much as 80% knocked out up there. They were down in Iowa paying, Minnesota was knocking on vineyard doors in Iowa, paying $1 a pound for grapes. Yeah, they were in advertising that on Midwest Wine Press and in the Iowa Wine Grower site. Illinois got hit really hard, not only by the cold spell. See, in Illinois, a lot of those Illinois growers have been taking the Chamberson and Traminette, Vignola, and they're pushing them clear north, as far north as Chicago. And they didn't get them Iowa, Norton even. They got hammered, big time hammered. And then they got a late frost over there, and that late frost just hit parts of Missouri too. Iowa, what we had was somewhere around, I would say 30–40% of our crop was lost. The western side of the state, probably more than the eastern side. But if you look at them, it's like, see, we can grow Traminette and Chamberson up our first row of counties in Iowa. That's about it.
And you're pressing on the Shamerson there. Right?
Oh yeah, we had that. And then we grow Norton up to 80, but we harvest in October, maybe the second week of October. But we had a lot of damage too. And then we had a lot of hail. Western side of Iowa got hit by hail pretty hard. So it wasn't a real good season in Iowa. But it did raise prices a little bit. Where $1,000 a ton is, I think, is a price of long ago. Minnesota, Wisconsin has been in the $1,400 to $1,600 range for several years. And Iowa, now I think our average price is gonna be in that $1,200 to $1,400 from now on. It's a little history about Iowa. About 2010, we got up to about 425 vineyards, somewhere in there. We're now down about 310. We went an average size of 3 acres now to 4 acres. Personally, I don't even think 4 acres is financially sustainable if you try to count your time to it, unless you're attached to a winery or something like that. So vineyards size is growing. Now we're averaging 4 acres, and the number of vineyards out there is dropping. And the other thing we're seeing in Iowa is that we'll have wineries now, because they're kind of a cluster effect, where you'll have one winery maybe sharing equipment with some vineyards. They may have a harvester, and then, for example, when the winery is bottling or something like that, they're sharing labor back and forth. So that's what we're seeing in Iowa. And you're up to 38 wineries in Kansas now, something like that. Is that right?
38 licensees, I think.
Yeah,
Something
so
like
you're
that.
ahead
I
of
think there's about-
Nebraska now.
Yeah, we're still investing.
But there ain't fruit.
Huh?
There's no fruit. Here,
Why?
there's not enough vineyards.
Oh, really?
Enough vineyards to support 20 wineries in the state.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
We got one over here in Manhattan, just got approval, didn't they? He's been calling around all summer wanting to buy fruit from everybody for next year, so he can open in July of next year.
I haven't heard about that.
So what kind of prices are we seeing on grapes delivered to wineries?
Oh, I think it depends on who the winery is that you're selling to.
I've heard anywhere from 12 to 1,500
$1,200
somewhere
to
in there.
$1,500, yeah.
I think that's fair. I don't think you can really do it for $1,000 a ton. I really,
I would agree with that.
yeah. And you're pushing it even at $1,200 a ton. All right, well, that's interesting.
Now, question I have for you, you asked me about my winter damage for this year. You know, at this point in time, I hadn't seen anything that was caused from anything this year or last winter. What I was seeing this year was winter damage that was from clear back in 10 and 11 and 12, where it got down extremely cold. And it was just showing up in the trunks.
That's what, and if you read some of the literature and stuff like that, it's a really stressful cold spell. It may take that vine 3-4 years to come back from that cold damage. And like crown gall, you know, I'm of the opinion that every vineyard has crown gall in it. And crown gall is a bacterial disease that shows up under stress. And if you crack that trunk or something like that. And so if you get winter injury, all of a sudden you get crown gall going. And it may take crown gall 3 years plus, usually within 3 years it will knock out that stem. You know, it takes a little bit of time to do that. And the way that works is the bacteria changes the RNA in the cambial tissue, and it's like cancer. It's undifferentiated tissue, and it just ends up girdling the stem, and there's no xylem. It just knocks out the xylem, and then it can't get any water or nutrients.
And you can tell in July whether it has it or not, real easy.
Red leaves. Yeah, that's one thing. Yeah, you're right, Terry. If you're getting fall colors in July, then you can look out over Vineyard, and if you see some red plants out there, those are the ones with crown gall. But it's, yeah. But you're saying 3 or 4, years later, you're seeing it now. You couldn't see it at the beginning, or?
It wasn't obvious on the vine. The vines went ahead and produced. I mean, it's been, you had some crown gall that showed up the following year, but not like it had, 3 years later. 3 years, and I took half my vineyard and took it out of production this year, replacing trunks.
So when you took it out and you're replacing the trunk, did you have, how many people here that have double trunk system? Everybody?
I'll bet, they better have.
Huh?
I don't like it.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't like it. I don't understand the advantage. I know I read the advantage, but
Well, okay, so who else, who here has single trunks?
that's,
One variety.
Real cold party?
We always,
Marquette.
we always let the sucker come up, just in case.
The, back around 2005, there was a huge controversy developed over double or single trunks. Are you aware of that, or?
no, I didn't catch that.
Well, it came out of, John Marshall started up in Minnesota. He was writing a newsletter for the Minnesota North. And then a lot of other people jumped on board, and there was like, it was like the Democrats and Republicans, you know, they were never gonna come together. And essentially what John Marshall and John's been growing grapes for 30-some years. I think his parents even grew grapes. But he, you know, his concept was that if you have a cold hardy variety, you have one trunk. And that one trunk is going to be more vigorous. You're going to have plants that are more similar. And when you prune those plants, each plant, you got one trunk, there's some uniformity there. And that way you know how to prune it. You know, and plus it's easier to train other people. And his theory was be having a one trunk on a really cold hardy variety, it's more cold hardy. With that one trunk. Trunk gets bigger faster. Old vines, you know, theory of better fruit and all that kind of stuff. And I'm guessing there's some part of that's right. And it's a hell of a lot easier to train people to prune a single trunk vine than it is a double trunk. Okay, and because double trunks, you know, you look at every vine, and every vine is a big decision. You know, do I have 30 buds over here and 20 buds over here? Or is it 15 buds? Because you got to look at the vine size and, you know, how the cordon and see what kind of capacity you get. So it's hard to do. So I'm kind of that theory. If you have a really cold, hard, tolerant variety, go single trunk. If you have a variety that's iffy, that could get hit, okay, go double trunk. Because double trunks, when you do get winter injury, very seldom do both trunks die. Okay, and plus, if one trunk does die, you got the other trunk and some buds to hold back that vigor. So you're going to get crop off of it. Now, and that's the way I feel until the last couple of years. And then I started seeing, it's kind of a site injury or a site situation where you have weather soils. It seems like even the cold tolerant hybrids will start showing crown gall coming through. The wet soils, it affects their health, and they're more susceptible to winter injury. And then you start seeing crown gall. Well, you get a crown gall on a single trunk. Okay, you know. And again, with crown gall, typically if you have a double trunk system, crown gall is usually on one side or another. So the crown gall I call the wild card. Everything even, I'd say a single trunk for cold hardy, double trunk for sensitive, if you're pushing a little bit too far north. But if you think you got a crown gall problem, you probably better go to a double trunk system. Anybody agree or disagree with that?
Sounds reasonable.
Well, I'm kind of with the same feelings and thoughts you are.
Yeah.
And the big question I have to ask is, we got two trunks coming up here, one of them, same exposure, same winter, same soil, same up above if you're pruning correctly. Why does this one get winter damage and this one didn't? Something's different in this one that got it than it is in this one.
Mm-hmm.
That's my theory. But what is it?
I don't know what it is.
I don't either.
Because it always, I mean, very seldom you see both trunks die.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Very seldom.
It's one, and I don't know what and, you know, whether it was a lot of potato leaf hoppers came in and hit one side of that more than injected toxin, and I don't know what it is, but yeah. But that's kind of the theory on double trunks, single trunks, and all that kind of stuff. don't know. How many people have had problems with herbicide drift down here this year?
Every year.
Are you getting any people, I mean, is anybody settling, getting claims or anything like that, or is it just, how's the Department of Agriculture? Are they getting better? I remember down here, I was here last winter, and I met with the Department of Agriculture. In fact, I did a program with them at the conference. Last year, or this year. It was back
January.
January, yeah. And I thought they were gonna change things and really jump on that.
They do come up with a new program. Easier to.
And you're in drift watch now,
Yeah,
aren't you?
they paid for us to join Drift Watch. That's,
No, I don't wanna offend anybody.
Oh, when was this, when did this new rule?
it's all right, we're recording this, so go ahead.
That's okay. I have a really good friend who works for the Department of Ag and the Water Resources.
Mhm.
They been moved from Topeka, where all the paperwork and everything's done to Manhattan, to K-State University. You need to reflect back to who the governor of the state of Kansas is right now, who is a big fan of deregulation. You don't want anybody to have any regulations to follow. I wasn't at the conference last year when the Department of Ag did their presentation. I have had experience with the Department of Ag and their pesticide divisions. I think they're a joke. They have no enforcement. They don't have no ability to enforce anything except a licensed applicator. And in Kansas, a farmer don't have to get a licensed applicator. And that's who's doing the damage. Because
And
they
the other
don't
thing I was
care.
surprised down here, based because of Kansas law, see in Iowa, a Department of Agriculture inspector can walk into any farm and demand, I mean, they normally call ahead of time, but you have to have your records, and they can walk on site. If they wanna investigate pesticide drift, they can walk on your property, you can't. And you can't do that here in Kansas.
No, you can't, and it's unfortunate that you can't do that, because it would be best if the licensed applicators, the commercial guys, got on board and said, we need regulations to keep this from happening, because it's giving them a bad name. Now, you're aware of what happened to Joanna,
Yeah.
okay? It was a neighbor that did this to her. It wasn't a commercial application, it was a neighbor. She's lost 75% of her vineyard.
14 acres, right?
Because of this negligent person. Now, from her, I won't say the name or anything like that, but the state guy went to interview this guy, and before it became fisticuffs, he left. And he should have taken the hits and then put the man in jail. I'm assuming she's going to pursue it. I hope to God she will. But there is nothing the state of Kansas can do to this guy. Nothing. They can't find him. You don't have a license, you can't pull that. So,
I don't know how,
and I think that's what stops. I think it needs to go a step farther in their enforcement. They need to be able to go in and take this person to court for negligence and stick it to them.
it used to be on these herbicide drift claims, it was in court, they would say it was chemical trespass. And the Supreme Court in Minnesota, I think about 2011, I think it was, struck that down and said, it isn't trespass, but you can sue on a call it a nuisance, and show neglects. So you can sue going that route, but prior to that, most of the claims were based on chemical trespass, so that we can't do that anymore. So you gotta, if you have an attorney, you call it an aggravated nuisance or something like that and go after them. Iowa, we're pretty aggressive. This past spring, we had one vineyard that was hit in 2012. It was 3 acres of a 4-acre vineyard with Roundup and 2,4-D, and they hired an attorney, and it ended up they got $150 a vine, so they got $250,000 for 3 acres of vines, and they're about 60% productive today. So they settled that. Had another one settle for $25 a vine. It was a herbicide hit that really didn't hurt the grapes, but she got tired of being hit every year. So she called the Department of Agriculture in, and she had an attorney, and they just went after it right away. And even though there wasn't a lot of damage, they just settled out of court with the insurance company. That was $25 a vine. Minnesota is a unique state. If you get hit in Minnesota by herbicides, they immediately put a stop sale on your vineyard. Because more than likely the herbicide isn't labeled. And if it is labeled, they have to do a chemical analysis. And if it's above the FTA limits, like 2,4-D is 5 parts per million, and they take the test at the time of the drift. So if you get drifted on in June, what's the probability of having 5 parts per million, 2,4-D, and those grapes come harvest? There isn't. But that's the way they're acting. So I even met with the Commissioner of Agriculture in Minnesota, his deputy, at the Cold Climate Conference last year, and we talked about that. But they're still doing it. So what that does to a vineyard is that if you're gonna turn it in and go for the gold, you have to go for the gold because you've lost your crop. You got to go you got to lawyer up, and you got to go. There's no halfway to it. So it really protects the drifter. And so that's the only state I know of in the United States that does that. Is they put a stop. If you get drifted upon, no sale on your grapes. It's weird. I found that out the hard way. I was in a vineyard last summer, a 20-acre vineyard up by the south of Minneapolis, and I got hit by 2,4-D. And I told the owner, you need to call the Department of Ag. He didn't have a cell phone, so I called it in.
Oh,
Yeah. Luckily, I didn't say the name of the vineyard, because once I said that we had 2,4-D injury in here, and it was from the pasture that I could see that was sprayed, and he said, now, Steve Poussin was his name, was the pesticide guy. He said, now, I'm not going to ask you the vineyard yet, because I want to tell you something. He said, you know that we're going to have to put a no sale on that vineyard. So I said, well, let's just forget about it then. And it was one of the members of the Minnesota Grapevine Association board. So then at the Cold Climate Conference, we got the Commissioner of Agriculture coming in as deputy, and we had to sit down and talk about it. So whether they're going to get it changed, I don't know, but it's one of their high priorities. This pesticide drift deal is coming to it's tough. There's a lot of legislation being proposed in different states, and there's a lot of cases where lawyers and I get quite a few contacts for consultants and stuff for the pesticide drift. Nebraska's having a hell of a time. They just got done meeting last week in Nebraska with legislative committees there, trying to do something in Nebraska, and they're just getting hammered with 2,4-D. The Department of Agriculture didn't help them one bit. So I don't know what you guys do out here in the Wild West. In Iowa, we don't have a problem. We look at most times in Iowa when we have pesticide drift in the vineyard, it's kind of your attitude, but that's a very profitable vineyard.
Well, one of the things that's been an advantage for the vineyards around me this year because of what happened to Joanne was the commercial applicators refused to spray any crops around vineyards this year. They said, no, I ain't spraying.
Now it's because
after this came out, once she filed a complaint with the state and they started their investigation, of course, that's the first place they go is to look at their books. They go, my goodness. Now, the bad part about that is the guy that's growing beans or corn around it or wants to do another crop after something comes out and needs a spray, he can't, nobody will do it for him. He's got to do it himself. And that's where I'm coming at, is saying these commercial guys, they're not taking advantage of the situation. They need to step in and they need to put their foot out and say, hey, this can be fixed. And to me, how many times a year do you spray wheat? Spray your fungicides on your grapes. How many times a year? Every week for 14 days?
Yeah.
So, and everybody's got a vineyard that's commercial is doing that, or just a little one, you gotta do that to keep it clean. They missed the boat. All these commercial applicators are missing money. Because they could have bought equipment to come into the vineyards and sprayed. They could be making money. They would understand the problem if they were out there doing this.
I think probably the number one reason they quit those the dealers aren't spraying, it's the insurance company. Is that in Iowa, the ag dealers today, it's harder than hell to get insurance, a lot of them are self-insured. And when they do get insurance, their deductible for herbicide drift claims are $10,000 to $15,000. So it's often the co-op board or it's the managers just decided, hey, we can't take that risk.
Well, I know down there in Florida, they've been complaining about enough, they're kind of backing off and will get called names like you wouldn't believe, so.
Well, hey, let's get on to the meeting, what we're talking about. Okay. I put this together, this is a cold injury and kind of, you know, how the plants acclimate in the fall, and what causes plants to acclimate in the fall is when you get shorter day lengths, and when it starts to get cooler. Okay, then what happens to that plant is that it starts to get that paraderm formation on the cane, that brown coloration. And what that is, that brown coloration on the cane that starts at the bottom, at the base, and works its way forward, what that is that is the phloem cells on the outside of there, okay, that they turn into cork cells. And those cork cells then secrete a waxy substance. So what you have is when you see that brown coloration, that's just almost like a sausage wrap. I mean, it's waterproof, you know, and it doesn't leak it. I mean, there's no liquid coming in, and it's also windproof, so desiccation from the wind. Okay, and so a natural senescence of that plant or paraderm formation starts at the base and it browns all the way up. And that's an indication when you, in the fall, when you get your first, when it starts to get really cold, like in late October, November, down here probably in November, ideally you'd like to have that whole cane brown. If it ain't all brown, then something's affecting that plant. Either too vigorous or something that it won't acclimate to the weather. So you get that paraderm formation, that's the initial step. Once that paraderm forms, that vine can stand within -5 to maybe 20 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the cultivar. And then the next step is when it starts getting your freezing cold weather, like in November. What happens is the plant in the trunk itself and the cordon is that the cells themselves start leaking their water in between the cells, so the cell contents actually dry out, okay, and that stem starts to dry out. And hormones are in effect here, and actually there's plugs put in the xylem that keeps water from coming up in the trunk, so the trunk is drying out, and below each bud there's actually a plug forming, okay, so that no more water can get out of the bud, because in the trunk it's the drying out of the cells so that when they freeze, they don't rupture. The ice crystals don't rupture the cells, okay? So the cells in the trunk are drying out. They're losing fluid out of those cells. And so when it does freeze, those ice crystals don't break the cells. Buds, it's a different story. In the buds, what you have is you've got sugars forming in those buds, amino acids and proteins that form an antifreeze solution in the bud. And then all of a sudden, the plant puts a plug below the bud. So you have a supersaturated solution that doesn't freeze in there, you know, it's got antifreeze in it. And each variety or each cultivar is different in how cold it will get. But that's what's going on during the acclimation process in the fall. Okay, and a lot of things can affect that acclimation process. You know, if you get defoliation or you get too much nitrogen or you get an early hard frost or something like that, ideally you just want the plants to go naturally up the first frost and then drop their leaves. Anything that will affect that, you know, it deters that, will affect your acclimation process, and it won't acclimate so it can stand cold weather. Then what happens is we have the deacclimation, and that normally happens, what, February usually, probably January here I imagine, where you get warm days and all that kind of stuff.
It starts at 2.
Huh?
It starts at 2.
I don't know, I don't live down here, I just, I
January
figured,
fall.
We get the freeze thaw.
yeah, and that's what happens is that when you start getting those warm days, the deacclimation process starts to happen pretty fast. And what happens is enzyme starts dissolving those plugs in the trunk, that xylem, and all of a sudden you got water coming up the trunk. Okay, and then The buds may not break right away, but what you had is you got enzymes are dissolving those plunks that are in, the plugs that are in the xylem, and now you got water in the ground going into the roots, coming up the trunk, and on those days where it gets warm and the sun hits those trunks, all of a sudden those cells start to come alive. The cambium cells and the phloem cells, they start to percolate. And what people don't realize is that at summer solstice at December 21st, the sun's right here. If you got a south-facing slope, you get 3 times more radiation hitting the trunk than here in the summer, as far as solar radiation. So what happens, that's one reason, the old, in horticulture, they'll paint the trunks white or silver or whatever to help some of that sun scald issue. So what happens with some of our vines is that they deacclimate pretty fast. And the more cold hardy they are, the faster they deacclimate. Vinifera, Cabernet Franc, okay, it won't deacclimate. It takes a lot of warm weather to deacclimate it. Frontenac, you know, wild grape, it doesn't take much, maybe 3 or 4 days, warm weathers. All of a sudden you get deacclimation, and then you can have some problems with that trunk. Okay, and it's usually the south and southwest facing side. How many of you can go out in your vineyard and look at the scars on your trunks? And can you see them on the south and southwest corners? Think about that. It's the farther you go north, the more you see of this cold injury. But it's common to walk into a vineyard, and if there is sun scalds going on, you're going to see it on the south. And you know, if there's something wrong with my vine, Mike, what do you think it is? Well, then you play that cat and mouse game where they're supposed to teach themselves, and you say, well, what? Look at all these scars. You get this crease right down the vine where dead tissue is trying to callus over. And eventually, well, they're all on the south and southwest facing sides. Okay, or if you start getting crown gall on that side, then it's kind of an indication that those plants are deacclimating a little bit too fast. And that's usually where we get into problems there. But this talks a little bit about the deacclimation process and the acclimation process, which is kind of boring. But then it gets into management options, and this is kind of where the rubber hits the road here. A lot of vineyards are put in the wrong place, and it's usually winter injury that'll really remind the grower that it's in the wrong place. And so if you got a vineyard that's if it's a wet site, poor soil site, or something like that, it'll show up as winter injury. Anything that affects the health of that plant, so it doesn't deacclimate correctly in the fall, you're going to start getting more cold injury hitting that plant. And then the other thing is the cultivar, which is number 1. I can't tell you, we would love to be able to grow Traminette in Iowa, you know, and we would love to grow Vignola all over Iowa, and Chamberson and Norton, and we pushed it too far north. And that's, you know, St. Vincent, Save All, we were pushing Save All clear up to Interstate 80, and it don't work. It just, you know, those things need to be in the bottom tier of Iowa, and then they're even sensitive. So often what is the case is that the winemakers, they want the Traminette and Save All, the Chamberson, and Norton, all that. It's what I think is, they got more vinifera in it, except for Norton. Makes a better wine. So we push them too far north, and they have to realize after a while that it ain't working. You're going to have to pull them out. And some sites, you know, the topography is one example of Max Creek Winery.
I've heard about that.
It's in a low area, you know. If you have a low area, and you're going to get hit by 2 things. You're going to have in the wintertime, that's going to be the coldest. Okay? Right at ground level or snow levels where it's going to get the coldest. And so you can really get the entire topographic area, that's where it's going to get the coldest. And also that's where you're going to have the most frost injury. Eventually, like in Max Creek, and this out in Lexington, Nebraska, they get hit all the time with frost out there in cold weather. And I I predict that there's gonna be a day that they may give up and trying to grow grapes on that bottom and try to move their, vineyard outside. It gets to the point where you can only stand so much damage every year, and you abandon the vineyard. And boy, there's been a lot of vineyards abandoned because we started out with the wrong site. And a lot of it has to do, it was too wet, too much clay, it's just root restriction problems. Aspect, and then I talked about that south-facing slope. If you have a south-facing slope, and that's what we all want for, ripening fruit and everything. But if you have a cold-sensitive variety, it's probably not a good idea to put on a south-facing slope. If it's in the wrong place on the south-facing slope, and then you do get a lot of deacclimation in the springtime, you're going to see more damage there. Reflective paint. I haven't seen a vineyard do this yet, but I also know the other side of the coin is I believe that painting the trunk white or hitting it with some silver paint, that's not a huge cost deal. You don't have to paint the whole trunk, just the south side. That might be a stopgap option to stop some of that damage. I do know this, if you leave the grow tube on there, and if you're on a south-facing aspect, it's a perfect site to have a crown gall seminar the following spring. And I've seen vines where that grow tube gets so warm in there on a south-facing slope that the cells start going, and then it freezes at night, and you'll have a hell of a ground, the crown gall goes to the top of the grow tube. Yeah, and then vine balance. I think the number one reason in Iowa, and most vineyards in the Midwest, where we see vines that don't make it through the winter, and it's because we don't know how to prune. We don't know how much crop to put on that vine. And if you want to have a vine that gets sick fast, overcrop it for several years. And there's varieties out there like St. Croix and Frontenac, and they'll just grow themselves almost to death. Now this is hard to believe in Iowa. Absolutely, the Shamerson, the Norton, the Sabal, the Traminette, the stuff we pushed up north got hit, and a lot of damage. To me, the number one vine in Iowa that had damage was Frontenac. Does anybody know how cold Frontenac gets before Frontenac starts getting winter injury?
Minus 25.
About 45. You get 45. It's half riparian. Get wild and grape. It's just cold. Well, with Frontenac, what happens is that it'll put out a hell of a lot of fruit. And I think what happened in a lot of these sites is that wherever you can see like a wet soil or a site where it isn't ideal, they'll often put Frontenac because it's half wild grape and it tends to make it, but it's easy to overcrop. And a prime example of this, Minnesota, their Marquette just got wiped out. You go to the research farm up at Chanhassen, where they do the Minnesota Research Farm grapes, where their Marquette is managed, just like shining your Cadillac up, Crop load is managed, all that. The Marquette up there at the research farm is perfect. Beautiful crop and everything else. And I think that Peter Hempstead, a grape breeder up in Minnesota, he even brought this up. He thinks that crop load is the number one thing. You gotta understand vine balance. The age of the vine and how much fruit that vine can handle so that it'll be a healthy plant. And if you overcrop the plant, you're going to be a lot more susceptible to injury in the fall or in the winter. Another thing is excessive leaf removal. I guess one thing we see in Iowa a lot of times, and I don't know whether you do it here, it's not a good idea. Usually about at veraison, they'll have Mexican crews go in the vineyards and they'll give them a call. I call it a Dutch boy haircut, where just about like this, and you've seen it. It'll come down maybe 2 feet, 2.5 feet, and then they'll cut everything off. Why do you think they do that? So that when the harvest crews come in, and especially the wineries when they had their harvest field days and stuff, they want to have it easy to get to the fruit. I can't think of a better way to screw up a vine than at Verasion, right? Knock off half the leaves, you know, and you see that a lot. And I try to preach that they shouldn't be doing that, but you want those leaves on there. You want 12 to 15 leaves minimum per cane. And if you got two big clusters on it, maybe 18 leaves or 20, you know. But you go in there at Verasion and start chopping all that stuff off where you've got these like 5-leaf canes or shoots hanging down, you're going to have trouble ripening the fruit, and you're going to have trouble for that plant acclimating in the winter for proper winter survival. Okay. What else there? Cordon height. This is common. Typically on VSP, we will often see more cold injury if it's lower to the ground than the high cordon. It just has to do with cold temperatures, low areas. The exception to that rule is if you got snow coming in the vineyard, it's more likely to cover over the low cordon system. Reduction in woody tissue. Reduction in woody tissue. If you're getting winter injury all the time, let's say if I wanted to try to grow Cabernet Franc or Merlot, maybe Pinot Noir in Iowa, I would, what I would do, one thing you could do is go an umbrella system, where your head of the plant is about 3 inches off the ground. So you got a trunk about like this, and then maybe your cordon might be like this, and then you've got some buds coming out, and then every year you're going to have canes. Okay, so what you can do then is that snow cover or cover it with mulch, and then just cover that up. That's one way you can do it. Because the more trunk you have up here, the theory is if you got real freezing weather, if you got more trunk tissue and more cordon tissue, there's a higher percentage of maybe cold injury you can have. Combing shoots downward. And this is a lot of different ways you want to think about when you're in vineyard, and you can't follow all the rules here. But if you have a vignole or a traminette or something, or vignole, let's say vignole, or a sable, they like to go straight up. If you constantly try to comb them down, you're devigoring that plant, okay? And when you debigger that plant, you reduce the photosynthetic carbohydrate production in that plant to get the roots in the trunk, and we know that has some effect on winter acclimation. Delayed pruning. By this, some of the nurseries and some people, I get this question often, are we going to prune? We'd like to prune in November, get it started. Not a good idea. Not a good idea. You want that plant to be completely acclimated. Then if you want to go in like January or late December, yeah, it's okay to prune. But if it's in the acclimation process, don't try to prune. That's going to mess it up too. Double or multiple trunks. I'm going to be more fan of that, where you have at least 2 trunks up. Some people are even putting more trunks. And another thing I'm becoming a fan of is always have 1 or 2 suckers that you're bringing up every year. Keep them. And if you look, some of the Mexicans that come out of California and come to Iowa, what they do, and they know, they've been pruning a lot of vines, is they'll usually keep at least 2 suckers. And then they just twine them, so they're bringing them up every year. Okay, you've seen it? And that's probably a good idea. Because of any kind of injury, you always got something to select there for replacement. And so I'm a big fan anymore. I'm looking at always keeping suckers. A lot of the literature tells you to keep suckers off all the time. Okay.
Question on keeping those.
Yeah.
All right. Is it better to keep one that's come off the existing trunk, or better to bring one up from under the ground?
The existing trunk is called a water sprout.
Okay.
It's still a latent auxiliary bud, and it's it'll work. It'll work.
It'll work.
Yeah, it'll work. Ideally, probably there ain't a lot. It comes down to plumbing technique. Is that You know, you want the shortest, least amount of restriction and least number of turbs on water flow. So ideally, if you're gonna have a trunk, you probably want to start at the base and come straight up. But if you don't have one down there, you can take a water sprout and use it too. Yeah. Okay. And that's another way you can see winter injury in a vineyard. If you see a lot of suckers coming up where you didn't have them before, that tells you there's probably some winter injury out there. Another thing is leaf disease control. If it's August and you're getting a lot of downy mildew and powdery mildew out there right after harvest, it may be a good idea to treat. But if you're 2 weeks away from frost, it's probably not it's not probably worth it. Another one is herbicide drift, and this is a big one. Phenoxy, but you know, the phenoxy herbicides just play all kinds of tricks on these vines, and often is the case if they're hit, you don't know what the injury is until next year, because they don't go to sleep. They just keep on growing. They don't get the paradigm formation that you want in the fall. And then, so that's why always when you get hit by 2,4-D or Bambil or the phenoxy herbicides, don't ever settle unless it's one hell of a deal until next year in June, see what kind of crop you have. Because there's a high percentage chance that you're going to get more winter injury out there. Now Roundup. I know vineyards, like commercial vineyards in Missouri, and I've talked to other ones too. Roundup is the #1 herbicide used on grapes. And I know vineyards that don't give a damn whether they hit their suckers with Roundup. Okay, up to about bloom. After bloom, then everything turns around. Now they're going to start translocating that Roundup down to the roots. And the worst case scenario that I run into often is people that go in for late season weed control. Let's say it's right about veration, they want to clean up the vineyard because they're going to have it's a winery and they're going to have the picking crew parties and all that. So they'll go in and spray and they hit those suckers. And if you really want to screw up a plant, hit Roundup, put Roundup on green tissue or the suckers later in the summer. It'll screw up the plant then. It won't acclimate during the winter, and next spring, have you seen this, Nick? Next spring, it looks like you type a dieback almost. Those leaves come out all crunched, and they swear to God somebody drifted on them. And it's because they hit those suckers late in the summer. So be careful of that when you're out there. Wind breaks, I believe, I think one way, if you're out in Kansas, Nebraska, I think maybe your best protection may be a windbreak. You know, it's just something. I've been on enough herbicide complaints that when I go out to a field or a herbicide complaint, if there's a bush line or something like that and there's drift coming through, the drift comes around the end. It often doesn't come through the windbreak. You can see it every time. So I'm kind of in favor, if you're in an area and you got 50,000 acres of wheat around you, or corn, or even soybeans now with Enlist 2,4-D, maybe if you're going to be in the long haul, putting up a windbreak is the way to go. Not only will it stop some of the drift, be a deterrent, but it also help get some snow to cover the soil so you don't have big fluctuations in temperature. Moist soils. 2 years ago, Dylan, you know this, our vineyards up there at Ames, we got down, it was last year. Yeah, we got down like freezing down at 51 inches or something like that. Yeah, something like that. And then the year before, 2012, when it was really dry, it froze deep and we had a lot of root injury to our vines. The nurseries were seeing a lot of root injury to their tree and potted plants where they store them outside. Moist, dry soils will freeze deeper and get colder. So if you do have irrigation system, how many people have irrigations here? So if it's really dry, you know, right after the leaves fall and stuff, go ahead and wet the ground underneath the vine. That's going to help out. Okay. Let's see. Trench planting up in, they play around with this. I know up in North Dakota, where they're digging a trench about a foot deep, maybe about 3 foot wide, and you plant the grapes in the trench. The idea is that the snow will drift in and they've got a snow cover there. That's under really serious cold conditions. I probably wouldn't do it. Graft union protection, everything I read is that if it's a vinifera graft, yeah, you gotta cover it over that graft to protect the sky now, the vinifera part. If it's a cold hardy graft, I haven't seen any literature tells me that you have to protect the graft union. You've got some graft?
Well, I haven't read anything on that except going off. Somebody says protect the graft union. They don't specify vinifera or French hybrids, but I think as they get older and get that callus bigger, it's not a problem.
Okay. Some people are grafting cold hardy to American rootstock. And that's the case, I don't think it's a problem. When you take vinifera on on an American rootstock, yeah, there probably is, because it's not the rootstock's going to be damaged, it's the scion tissue where it connects the vinifera scion, so that needs to be protected. Now, usually want at least 4 inches of soil up higher than that where it connects right there. Nitrogen applications, the one thing I can say there is too much nitrogen, it's kind of like 2,4-D, you get too much growth and in the fall. So if you're going to use nitrogen, make sure you put it on mid-May to mid-June and then shut her down. Maybe 30, 50 pounds of N if you need it. Base it on, I would base that on a petiole test probably if you're going to do that. Sometimes you can walk in a vineyard, and if the whole damn vineyard is yellowish colored, there's a pretty good indication maybe nitrogen might be a problem. You may want to play around with that. Late season weed control, in most cases, it's a cosmetic. You don't really need it, and by having weeds under the wire, that's taking up excess moisture and it's hardening the plant. And another way you can harden that plant is, let's say you get a wet fall, let the row middles grow up. The higher the row middles get up, the deeper the root system, the more moisture they're taking away from that plant, because too much moisture for a vineyard in the fall will keep it from deacclimating or acclimating the way you want. Okay. Harvest timing. I never thought about this until 2010. I went out to the Finger Lakes and looked at some of the Badal where they were making ice wine, and one of the concerns of having that fruit hang until it gets 18 degrees so they can harvest those frozen grapes is that it does add extra stress to that vineyard. You're from that, you know all about that. It does add extra stress. So if you're going to hang fruit out there for a long time, that's a concern too as far as how cold hardy that plant is and where it's going to go. Rootstocks. If you're going to buy rootstocks, you can take a vignole and put it on a cold hardy rootstock and get maybe a few degrees extra cold hardiness out of it. There is some effect there. Dr. Ann Fennell at South Dakota has done some research on this, and it does affect the scion plant. And then the vineyard, everything's there, vineyard row middle. So that's some of the things you can make them more hardy, a big list. If any of you come up with an idea that I didn't come up with, say, hey, you can do this too, let me know. I just brainstormed for almost a week trying to figure out all the things that you can do to do it. But if you constantly have cold entry, these are ways you can make that vineyard a little bit more cold tolerant out there. Okay, now let's go in. Now we got injury out there. What do you do? First thing is, if you got plants that constantly get hit by winter injury, eventually you got to decide on something, because the profitability of that vineyard is based on how much crop you get. So you may have to replant. So get rid of the cold sensitive cultivars and bite the bullet and put something in there. And in some cases, if you're getting hit all the time, just walk away from the site and pick another vineyard site.
What would you consider cold, since we're a little further south?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously I can look at this list, but I mean,
yeah.
Chalmerson would be.
So you're down here and you're 6A, and that's -10 to -5 degrees, okay? And Chalmerson, I think, is -10?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, something like that. Do I have it on here?
I mean, we're kinda on the,
See, I don't even have Chamberson on here because I don't remember. Well, yeah, I do. Yeah, it's negative 10 degrees. Yeah.
so we're right on the,
You're right on the edge. Yeah.
that's the,
Yeah.
probably, then yellow too, I mean.
Yeah,
minus
see, that's where you're, so what's the ultimate answer there is global warming. It's gonna get warmer,
So they say.
but it's not happening.
How come Antarctic ice is bigger than ever before?
And we're gonna have, you know, that's kind of,
Polar vortex.
yeah. I didn't even know what a polar vortex was until this. Now everybody knows what it is. It's when it gets really cold.
Yeah. Same thing we did 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Here, it's
Yeah,
that
they're
big
here.
for it now.
They just got a new name for this.
So,
Yeah.
basically, we're pushing the limit on Tramonette, it looks like, in Chalmerson.
Yeah. Well, no, I wouldn't say you're pushing the limit. I would just go double trunk system.
Okay.
That's what I do on that. Yeah. If you're in the marginal area, that's where you make sure you get multiple
Whether you're
trunks.
right or not, that's best.
And make dang sure you keep, you know, suckers coming up. So you always, so if you have some twine out there, so if you have a sucker, always have one or two suckers you can tie around out there for renewal. That's what you do. Because it's all, the last thing you want is a condition where you get the whole trunk dead and you maybe, let's say you got one sucker or none. You got bigger problems that it's gonna take years to get it out of that cycle. All this bigger, and if it comes up fully vigorous, it ain't gonna shut down come winter and it's gonna get hit again. So it's always good to have some extra buds out there. Buds is the insurance for a lot of different things. Okay. If there is damaged parts out there, go ahead and remove those things. But if you've got, you know, like this year, we had a lot of trunks that were completely dead. And I told people just leave them. Okay? I mean, if you've got cordons completely dead, cut them off, whatever. But if you got a trunk there, go ahead and save it, because you can use that like a stake to help bring it up. And if there may be a chance, there may be a water sprout will come up later on. Because one thing on trunks and even cordons is that, you know, if you get hit really hard with, and I've got this down here, delayed pruning or something like that under that, is that, yeah, look for basal buds break later. When you have blanks on that cordon out there, or the trunk seems dead, tertiary buds takes 2 or 3, about 2 weeks, 3 weeks later for a tertiary bud to break versus a primary. And then a basal bud or an auxiliary bud along the cordon or a basal bud, hell, that may take a month sometime to pop out. So if you got a lot of severe damage, wait and see what you have before you cut that vine up, because you may have some buds pop out there. Okay. Let's see. The rule of thumb is you prune the cold hardiest first. If you're going to get out there, and let's say you've got a month of pruning out there, go for the cold hardiest first. Because those are the ones you're removing buds, you're removing insurance. You don't want to do that to the cold sensitive ones. Start with the cold hardy pruning and then work to the least cold hardy. Double pruning, I'm a big fan of this. Unfortunately, a lot of vineyards aren't. You know, it's like, they want to get it pruned once. But I'm a big fan for 2 reasons. One is insurance. If you need 60 buds per plant, leave 120 or 100. That way, if you got, you know, you can wait then. And when those buds start to swell and pop, then you come back. You get 90% of the pruning done. And so you leave 50% to 100% more buds than you need. And then you come back and you can look at the buds that are swelling and pick the canes that you want. You know, it works out well.
On that swelling, don't they swell from the top down?
Yes.
Okay, so you've got to wait a little bit longer for that.
But the thing of it is that if you're leaving 2 bud spurs or 3 bud spurs, you only got 6 bud spurs.
That's true.
Yeah, so, but they'll start swelling on you.
Sure.
Yeah, and if they're swelling out, and you also get your winter injury from the worse at the tip on the way back.
Sure.
The other thing I like about long pruning is that you can have people that don't know anything about pruning go in and prune. Just say, hey, prune everything within about 1 foot of the water and get that stuff out of there. Then you wait to the first week of April and you got the buds swelling out there. then you can walk in and prune the rest. And what's nice about that, you can just drop it on the ground. The mower can chew it up. You don't have to worry about carrying all that stuff out. Now, if I'm wrong, if anybody has an argument on any of this, and usually the double pruning, this will bring up an argument in every.
Well, if you're gonna use somebody that's never pruned before, you wanna get them for 1 year.
Yeah.
Because once they prune, they don't ever renew.
That's why.
Good argument.
That's why all vineyard owners used to have friends and relatives.
Yeah, exactly. Between harvest and pruning, you're pretty much done.
Yeah. So, now as far as when you're pruning too, when you go through there and you've got buds breaking, of course you want the canes that are like a pencil thickness, 3/8 inch. Anytime you get around 1/2 inch thickness, that means that there's a good chance that's a bull cane. It was too vigorous, and a pretty good chance it had winter injury, may not fruit on you. Okay. The other thing that's bad about bull canes is that if you're taking a bull cane and trying to make a cordon out of it, the spacing's too far, the bud spacing, because there's just too much vigor. You may get 8 inches or so, or 10 inches between nodes. So the last thing you want is, sometimes you don't have a choice. You just need vegetation out there. But ideally you want about pencil thickness or 3/8 inch cane if you're going to select anything.
If you're gonna double prune, what's the earliest you'd still start? Early, late December?
Yeah, you could, once you through the, if you look at that chart, the coldest period,
Sure.
for down here, I'm gonna say probably by end of January, you should be able to get in there and start pruning.
That's what,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. But there's a lot of people, they just wanna prune once
Yeah. It's more
and get it done. Yeah, and then they find out, I can't tell you how many times, boy, I had a lot of winter damage, Mike, if I used to see the vigor now. Because the buds that they saved, now there's hardly any fruit on them. Okay. And then cultural management, anytime you got a lot of winter damage, you still have fertility, you still have a spray schedule. Try to do everything you can to keep that plant growing well, healthy. And oftentimes it may take you 2 or 3 years to get out of a winter kill field. But the whole deal with this paper is, so if you want to grow those sensitive varieties, now you've got some, hey, here's some tactics I can use so I don't get more injury. Okay. Now, Nick, you didn't say anything.
You're right.
Okay, that's all. Any other questions at all? Yeah. So.
You said that lignification and the formation of the paraderm to the distal end of the cane that's enough of a signal that you've achieved hardening off for the winter?
I think
or any
so,
other
yeah.
indications?
Yeah, what I've seen is sometimes it doesn't go all the way. Ideally,
Right.
you'd want to. But that tells you that once that paradigm's all formed, it's pretty well acclimated. Yeah. And you can see vineyards that are hit by 2,4-D. It'll be like November runs, and you can see the paradigm only formed maybe a foot or half for that. Yeah.
That far out.
Yeah, and then it turns green. And then that's a sign. I should put that in there. If you don't have paraderm formation, if you got green canes come November, you're in trouble.
So it's not the health of the vine that's causing that, it's 2,4-D.
No, it can be if you take too much leaf off. If it's a health of the vine, you have poor health. It can be 2,4-D. It can be too much nitrogen. It can be too much water. As far as from veraison on.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Anything that keeps that plant growing 100 miles an hour and won't let it go to sleep,
That makes sense.
Yeah. Ideally, you'd like to have a normal crop, no 2,4-D drift, and and then let the leaves still be green right up to first frost.
So that plant is actually trying to grow too fast, not shutting down after it hits
Right.
the 2,4-D.
Right. That's correct. It's just
Because the plant quits growing, so it looks like.
the 2,4-D goes to the meristematic tissues, the growing points. It goes to the roots, and it goes to the tips, the buds, and the tips, and it just keeps them growing. And that's what phenoxy herbicides do. And that's why never settle on a herbicide drift case until you see what kind of crop load you have the following June. And they'll do, the insurance companies, and they will do everything they can to settle because they know the same thing. And plus, they want to get it off their desk by the first of the year. It has to do with generally accepted accounting principles and all that kind of stuff. A lot of the insurance companies will use a $25,000. They'll do everything they can to sell a $25,000 deal by the end of the year. Okay, if it's over $25,000, then they'll often carry it through to what the product is. That's just kind of a rule of thumb that I get from the insurance. Any questions?